On the afternoon of June 5th, Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder, CO of the Ranger Force, the 2nd and 5th Ranger Battalions, paid a visit to Companies A, B, and C of the 2nd Battalion on their transport, the Prince Charles. He was going to lead Companies D, E, and F on an assault at Pointe du Hoc, a sheer cliff some 40 meters high about. 7 kilometers west of the right flank of Omaha Beach. A, B, and C were going in. At the Charlie sector of Omaha, to the immediate right of Company A of the 116th Regiment, Rudder, a 1932 graduate of Texas A&M, where he received a commission in the reserves, had been a college football coach and teacher before going on active duty in 1941. He knew how to give inspirational talks before going into action. On this occasion, he told Companies A, B, and C, "Boys, you are going on the beach as the first Rangers in this battalion to set foot on French soil, but don't worry about being alone. When D, E, and F take care of Pointe du Hoc, we will come down and give you a hand with your objectives. Good luck, and may God be with you." In the event, almost none of this worked out, not for A, B, and C, or for D, E, and F. Most of the game plan had to be abandoned even before the action began. C Company was alone when it landed, and virtually alone through the day. D, E, and IF companies came in at the wrong time from the wrong direction at Point du Hoc. Most of the special equipment for scaling the cliff never made it to the shore. Much of what did failed to work, when the companies nevertheless made it. To the top, they found that their objective, 5 150mm cannon capable of dummy, nading both Utah and Omaha beaches, were not in the casemates. Apparently what the Rangers had accomplished in one of the most famous and heroic actions of D-Day had gone for naught, and the skills and sacrifices of one of the most elite and highly trained forces in the Allied Army had been wasted. But in fact, what the Rangers accomplished at Omaha and at Pointe du Hoc was critical to the ultimate success at both American beaches. 10 years after the event, Colonel Rudder visited the site with his 14-year-old son and Collier's reporter W.C. Hines. Looking up at the cliff at Pointe du Hoc, he asked, "Will you tell me how we did this? Anybody would be a fool to try this. It was crazy then, and it's crazy now." The plan was for Company C to land on the far right flank of Omaha Beach and follow Company A of the 116th Regiment up the Vierville Draw, pass through the village, turn right, and clear out the area between the beach and the coastal road, about a kilometer inland, running from Vierville to Pointe du Hoc. In that area, the Germans had some 20 pillboxes, bunkers, Tobrucks, and open-gun amphibious, Mentz, plus a radar station. The schedule called for Company C to accomplish its mission in 2 hours, that is, by 0830. Companies A and B would land at 0730 at Pointe du Hoc if given a signal that Rudder needed them there for reinforcement. If no signal was received, presumably meaning that Rudder's force had failed, they would land at the mouth of the Vierville Draw, from which spot they would move to the high ground, turn right, and proceed west on the coastal road to attack Pointe du Hoc from the land side. For Ranger Companies A, B, and C, in short, everything depended on Company A of the 116th Regiment, securing the Vierville Draw and the village itself in the initial moments of the assault. But Company A of the 116th was wiped out at the beach. Company C of the Rangers came in a few minutes later at 6:45 in an isolated position at the far western edge of Omaha, just beyond the Vierville Draw, the closest. American troops were more than 2 kilometers to the east at Dog Red, going in on the heels of the naval bombardment before the Germans opened fire. The Rangers were in a cocky mood. "It's going to be a cinch," one of them said. "I don't think they know we're coming." Sergeant Donald Scribner recalled the men in his boat singing Happy Anniversary to Sergeant Walter Geldon, June 6, 1944, was Geldon's third wedding anniversary. They cheered when the LCTRs launched, their rockets, only to groan when they saw the rockets fall short and harmlessly in the water. Their dismay increased as they realized, in the words of Lieutenant Gerald Heaney, there was no one on the beach in front of us, and we were going to touch, down in a sector that had not been invaded by other American soldiers. When Heaney's LCA hit a sandbar, the British coxswain called out a cheery, "This is as far as I go, Yanks," and lowered the ramp. German machine gun fire ripped across the boat. The first man out was immediately hit. Heaney saw he had no chance if he went down the ramp, so he jumped over the side. All around me, men were being killed and wounded. I ran as hard as I could to ward shore, and I remember being so exhausted when I reached the shore that it was all I could do to make it to the cliff. The CO of C Company, Captain Ralph Goranson, recalled, going across the beach was just like a dream with all the movement of the body and mind just automatic motion. He made it to the shelter at the base of the cliff. To Sergeant Marvin, Lutz, crossing the beach was like a horrible nightmare. Nevertheless, like his CO, he moved automatically, the payoff from the training maneuvers. The cliff was sheer, about 30 meters high, just to the west of the Vierville. Draw. At its base, men were out of sight of German machine gunners, but still vulnerable to mortar fire and to grenades dropped over the edge by Germans on top. They were concussion grenades, universally called potato mashers by the GIs because of their shape. As they came down, Pit Michael Gargas called out, "Watch! Out, fellows! Here comes another mashed potato." 6. Sergeant Scribner's boat was hit 3 times by artillery fire. The first shell tore the ramp completely off the boat, killing the men in front and covering the others with blood. The second hit the port side. Scribner started to climb over the rear, starboard side when he noticed a 60mm mortar lying on the bottom of the craft. He stopped to pick it up when the third shell tore out the starboard side. Somehow, he made it into the water. I was carrying a radio, my rifle, my grenades, my extra ammunition, my bedroll, all my gear, and I started sinking in the channel. I didn't think I was ever going to stop going down. Scribner made it to the shore. He cannot recall how, and tried to run across the beach. I remember dropping 3 different times. Each time I did, machine. Guns burst in front of my face in the sand. I didn't stop because I knew what was coming. I dropped because I was so tired. When he made it to the base of the cliff, I looked back, and I saw Walter Geldon lying out on the beach with his hand raised up, asking for help. Walter never made it. He died on his 3rd wedding anniversary. Lieutenant Sidney Salomon, leading 2nd Platoon of C Company, was first off his boat. He went to the right into chest-deep water as automatic weapons and rifle fire sprayed the debarking Rangers. The second man off, Sergeant Oliver Reed, was hit. Loman reached over and pulled him from under the ramp just as the craft surged forward on a wave. He told Reed to make it the best he could and started wading toward the shore. By this time, the Germans had zeroed in on the ramp. Ranger. After Ranger was hit by small arms fire as they jumped into the water, and in Addy. Tie-in mortar shells landed around the craft, making geysers of water. Salomon made the base of the cliff. He looked back. Bodies lay still, where they had fallen, trickles of blood reddening the sand. Some of the wounded were crawling as best they could, some with a look of despair and bewilderment on their toured and pain-racked faces. Others tried to get back on their feet, only to be hit again by enemy fire. Bodies rolled back and forth at the water's edge, the English channel almost laughing as it showed its might over man and played with the eyes as a cat would with a mouse. Of the 68 Rangers in Company C, 19 were dead, 18 wounded. Only 31 men made it to the base of the cliff. The company had yet to fire a shot. Its experience in the first few minutes on French soil had been nearly as disastrous as that of A Company, 116th. But the Rangers had some advantages. Despite the grenades and mortar fire, they were more secure at the base of the cliff than the survivors of A Company were. At the seawall on the other side of the Vierville draw, their company commander, Capt. Ralph Goranson, along with 2 platoon leaders, Litz William Moody and Sidney Salomon, were with them to provide leadership. And they were elite troops, brought to a fever pitch for this moment. For example, Sergeant Scribner recalled. Sergeant Duke Golas. He had about half his head blown away by a grenade, and he was still standing at the bottom of the cliff, firing his weapon, hollering at the krauts up above to come out and fight. The officers, meanwhile, realized the company was alone, that the Vierville draw was not only not opened, but was bristling with German defenders, and that their only alternative, other than cowering at the base of the cliff and getting killed, was to climb the cliff. Fortunately, they had been through cliff-climbing training and had some special equipment for the task. Lieutenants Moody and Salomon and Sergeants Julius Belcher and Richard Garrett moved to their right until they found a crevice in the cliff, using their bayonets for successive handholds, pulling each other along, they made it to the top of the crest. There, Moody attached some toggle ropes to stakes in a minefield and dropped them to the base of the cliff, enabling the remainder of the company to monkey walk them to the top. By 0730, Company C of the 2nd Ranger Battalion, or what was left of it, was on the crest. According to the official Army history, it was probably the first assault unit to reach the high ground. On the cliff, the Rangers saw what they always called thereafter a fortified house. Actually, it was not fortified, although it might as well have been, as it was a typical Norman stone farmhouse. It overlooked the draw and was surrounded by a maze of communications trenches. Behind the house, the Germans had numerous two-day brooks and other types of pillboxes, plus an extensive trench system. From the house, the Germans were firing on the Rangers. C Company's mission was to move west along the high ground, but Captain Goranson decided to first of all attack the house and clean out the trenches behind it. Lieutenant Moody led a patrol against the house. He kicked in the door and killed the officer in charge, then began a search through the trenches. Moody was killed by a bullet through his forehead. Lieutenant Salomon took command of the patrol. It moved down the trenches using white phosphorus grenades to clear out pillboxes. Sergeants George Morrow and Julius Belcher spotted a machine gun that was N-Fi. Lading the western end of Omaha Beach, one of those guns that had killed so many Rangers an hour earlier. It was firing continuously down at the beach again as the follow-up waves attempted to get across the sand. In a pitiless rage, Belcher ran to ward the position, oblivious of his own safety. He kicked in the door of the pillbox and threw in a white phosphorus grenade. As the phosphorus began to burn on their skins, the Germans abandoned their gun and ran out the door, screaming in agony. Belcher shot them down as they emerged. Not everyone was brave. Lieutenant Heaney recalled an officer whose name I will not use. He had been one of the most physically active officers all during training. We all felt that he would be an outstanding combat soldier. But I found this. Officer in the bottom of a slit trench, crying like a baby and totally unable to continue. Sergeant White assigned one of his men to bring him back to the beach for evacuation, and this was the last I ever heard of him. Captain Goranson, meanwhile, had seen a section of men from the 116th Regi, meant landing just below the cliff. It was a kilometer off course. He sent a ranger, down to guide them to the top, providing C Company with its first reinforcements. The Germans were constantly reinforcing, bringing men in from the draw and the village via their communications trenches. There were far more German than Amer. Icon reinforcements. At Utah, the paratroopers prevented the Germans from sending reinforcements forward to the beach. At Omaha, there were no paratroopers, and the Germans had freedom of movement behind the beach. An all-day firefight ensued on the cliff to the west of the Vierville draw. Goran's sun was not strong enough to dislodge the Germans. His men would clear out a trench, move on, only to have fresh German troops reoccupy the position. Lieutenant Salomon was leading a platoon of 3 men. He described a typical AC. Tian. We proceeded further down the trench, around a curve. We came upon a German mortar crew in a fixed gun position, some more grenades, more rifle, and Tommy gun fire as we continued through the trenches. To Sergeant Scribner, it seemed that the day would never end. Lieutenant Salomon despaired. Looking down on the beach below, he saw chaos. Up until noon, D-Day, he later commented. I thought the invasion was a failure, and I wondered if we could make a successful withdrawal and try the invasion sometime again in the near future. For most of the Rangers, this was the first combat experience. It was a mark of how well they had been trained, and a textbook example of what training can accomplish, that they completely outfought the Germans in their fortified positions. They did so not by fighting regardless of loss, but by using basic tactics ride out with enthusiasm, balanced by proper caution. The next day, a U.S. Army quartermaster burial party reported the result. There were 69 German dead. In and around the fortified house and trench system, 2 American. For C Company of the Rangers and the section from the 116th, this was an isolated action. They were the only Americans on the west side of the Vierville draw. They were completely out of touch because all of the radios had been lost. They did get some help from the Navy, not always welcome, unaware that the Rangers were. On the cliff, destroyers fired some 20mm and 5-inch guns on the position. Sergeant Scribner saw a 5-inch shell score a direct hit on a pillbox. He was amazed at it. Only put in a den about 6 inches deep. Those Germans really knew how to build. Their emplacements. Sergeant William Lindsay was in a concrete pillbox when it received 2 direct hits from 5-inch shells. He lost a tooth and was knocked silly by the concussion. 3 times during the day he had to be stopped by fellow Rangers from walking off the cliff. That evening, he confronted Colonel Taylor of the 116th. Red-faced, cursing, he accused Taylor of stealing his rifle. All the while, he had the rifle slung over his shoulder. The incident gave the Rangers who saw it a laugh. After Lindsay recovered his senses, as he did in a few hours, and a certain sympathy for the Germans. Caught inside their casemates when 14-inch shells from the battleships exploded against them. I was worried as all hell on top of the cliff, Sergeant Charles Semchuk later said, about the day, just waiting for the Jerrys to push us back into the channel. They had the chance to do it. D-Day night, when we made contact with our A and B companies, my spirits and morale rose 100%. I felt like doing handsprings, for I was so happy. I knew then that the Jerrys had muffed their one chance for victory. I never again want to be in another D-Day. Sergeant Lutz echoed that last sentiment. Brother, I say this, no more D-Days for me if I can. Help it. C Company had not completed its mission. Indeed, it could be said it never even got started on its mission. Its action was minor in scale, a small unit engagement of inconsequential size when measured by the number of men involved. Yet, it was critical. by occupying the Germans on the west side of the Vierville Draw, and on the cliff, the Rangers diverted some of the machine gun fire that otherwise would have added to the carnage on the beach. By no means did the Rangers do it. Alone, but without them, the passage up the Vierville Draw would have been, at best, even more costly. At worst, no Americans would have gotten up that draw on. D-Day. Companies A and B of the 2nd Rangers came in at 0740 on Dog Green, the 5th. Ranger Battalion came in at 0750 on Dog White, to the east of the mouth of the Vierville Draw. There they became, in effect, a part of the 116th Infantry, to the point that many of the ad hoc fighting units formed on the beach were composed of a mix of Rangers and infantry from the 116th. Thus, the experience of the Rangers on the east side of the draw is best understood when told together with that of the 116th drive to the top of the bluff, as related in the following chapter. The Allied bombardment of Pointe du Hoc had begun weeks before D-Day. Heavy bombers from the U.S. 8th Air Force and British Bomber Command had repeatedly plastered the area, with a climax coming before dawn on June 6th. Then, the battleship Texas took up the action, sending dozens of 14-inch shells into the position. Altogether, Pointe du Hoc got hit by more than 10 kilotons of high explosives, the equivalent of the explosive power of the atomic bomb used at Hiroshima. Texas lifted her fire at 0630, the moment the Rangers were scheduled to. Touchdown. Colonel Rudder was in the lead boat. He was not supposed to be there. Lieutenant General Clarence Hubner, CO of the 1st Division and in overall command at Omaha. Beach had forbidden Rudder to lead companies D, E, and F of the 2nd Rangers into Pointe du Hoc, saying, "We're not going to risk getting you knocked out in the first round." "I'm sorry to have to disobey you, sir," Rudder had replied. "But if I don't take it, it may not go." The Rangers were in landing craft assault, LCA boats, manned by British seamen. The LCA was built in England on the basic design of Andrew Higgins' boat, but the British added some light armor to the sides and gun walls. That made the LCA slower and heavier. The British were sacrificing mobility to increase security, which meant that the LCA rode lower in the water than the LCVP. On D-Day morning, all the LCAs carrying the Rangers took on water as spray, washed over the sides. One of the 10 boats swamped shortly after leaving the transport area, taking the CO of D Company and 20 men with it. They were picked up by an LCT a few hours later. "Give us some dry clothes, weapons, and ammunition, and get us back into the point. We gotta get back." "Capt. Duke," Slater said as he came out of the water. But his men were so numb from the cold. Water that the ship's physician ordered them back to England. One of the two. Supply boats bringing in ammunition and other gear also swamped. The other, sup. Ply boat had to jettison more than half its load to stay afloat. That was but the beginning of the foul-ups. At 0630, as Rudder's lead LCA App approached the beach, he saw with dismay that the coxswain was headed toward Pointe de la Percée, about halfway between the Vierville Draw and Pointe du Hoc. After some argument, Rudder persuaded the coxswain to turn right to the object. Tive. The flotilla had to fight the tidal current, the cause of the drift to the left, and proceeded only slowly parallel to the coast. The error was costly. It caused the Rangers to be 35 minutes late in touch. Ingdown, which gave the German defenders time to recover from the bombard, meant climb out of their dugouts and man their positions. It also caused the flotilla to run a gauntlet of fire from German guns along 4 kilometers of coastline. One of the 4 DUKWs was sunk by a 20mm shell. Sergeant Frank South, a 19-year-old medic, recalled, "We were getting a lot of machine gun fire from our left flank alongside the cliff, and we could not, for the life of us, locate the fire. Lieutenant James Eichner, Rudder's communications officer, remembered bailing water with our helmets, dodging bullets, and vomiting all at the same time. USS Satterley and HMS Talabant destroyers saw what was happening and came in close to fire with all guns at the Germans. That helped to drive some of the Germans back from the edge of the cliff. D Company had been scheduled to land on the west side of the point, but because of the error in navigation, Rudder SIG nailed by hand that the 2 LCAs carrying the remaining D Company troops join the other 7 and land side by side along the east side. Lieutenant George Kirchner, a platoon leader in D Company, recalled that when his LCA made its turn to head into the beach, my thought was that this whole thing is a big mistake, that none of us were ever going to get up that cliff. But then the destroyers started firing and drove some of the Germans back from the edge of the cliff. 48 years later, then retired Colonel Kirchner commented, "Some day I would love to meet up with somebody from Satterley so I can shake his hand and thank him." The beach at Pointe du Hoc was only 10 meters in width as the flotilla approached, and shrinking rapidly as the tide was coming in. At high tide there would be virtually no beach. There was no sand, only shingle. The bombardment from air and sea had brought huge chunks of the clay soil from the point tumbling down, making the rocks slippery, but also providing an 8-meter buildup at the base of the cliff that gave the Rangers something of a head start in climbing the 40-meter cliff. The Rangers had a number of ingenious devices to help them get to the top. One was 25-meter extension ladders mounted in the DUKWs, provided by the London Fire Department. But one DUKW was already sunk, and the other 3 could not get a footing on the shingle, which was covered with wet clay, and thus rather like greased ball bearings. Only one ladder was extended. Sergeant William Stivison climbed to the top to fire his machine gun. He was swaying back and forth like a metronome, German tracers whipping about him. Lieutenant Elmer Dutch Vermeer described the scene. The ladder was swaying at about a 45-degree angle, both ways. Stivison would fire short bursts as he passed over the cliff at the top of the arch, but the Duke floundered so badly that they had to bring the fire ladder back down. The basic method of climbing was by rope. Each LCA carried 3 pairs of rock jet guns, firing steel grapnels, which pulled up either plain 3/4-inch ropes, toggle ropes, or rope ladders. The rockets were fired just before touchdown. Grapnels with attached ropes were an ancient technique for scaling a wall or cliff, tried and proven. But in this case, the ropes had been soaked by the spray, and in many cases were too heavy. Rangers watched with sinking hearts as the grapnels arched in toward the cliff, only to fall short from the weight of the ropes. Still, at least one grapnel and rope from each LCA made it. The grapnels grabbed the earth, and the dangling ropes provided a way to climb the cliff. To get to the ropes, the Rangers had to disembark and cross the narrow strip of beach to the base of the cliff. To get there, the Rangers had 2 problems to overcome. The first was a German machine gun on the Rangers' left flank, firing across the beach. It killed or wounded 15 men as it swept bullets back and forth across the beach. Colonel Rudder was one of the first to make it to the beach. With him was Colder Travis Trevor, a British commando who had assisted in the training of the Rangers. He began walking the beach, giving encouragement. Rudder described him as a great big 6 feet 4 inches, black-haired son of a gun, one of those staunch Britishers. Lieutenant Vermeer yelled at him, "How in the world can you do that when you are being fired at?" "I take 2 short steps and 3 long ones," Trevor replied, "and they always miss me." Just then, a bullet hit him in the helmet and drove him to the ground. He got up and shook his fist at the machine gunner, hollering, "You dirty son of a bitch." After that, Vermeer noted, he crawled around like the rest of us. The second problem for the disembarking Rangers was craters caused by bombs or shells that had fallen short of the cliff. They were underwater and could not be seen. Getting off the ramp, Sergeant South recalled, my pack and I went into a bomb crater, and the world turned completely to water. He inflated his May west and made it to shore. Lieutenant Kirchner was determined to be first off his boat. He thought he was. Going into a meter or so of water as he hollered, "Okay, let's go," and jumped. He went in over his head, losing his rifle. He started to swim in, furious with the British coxswain. The men behind him saw what had happened and jumped to the sides. They hardly got their feet wet. So instead of being the first one ashore, I was one of the last ashore from my boat. I wanted to find somebody to help me cuss out the British Navy, but everybody was busily engrossed in their own duties, so I couldn't get any sympathy. 2 of his men were hit by the machine gun enfilading the beach. This made me very angry because I figured he was shooting at me and I had nothing but a piss toll. Kirchner picked up a dead Ranger's rifle. My first impulse was to go after this machine gun up there, but I immediately realized that this was rather stupid, as our mission was to get to the top of the cliff and get on with destroying those guns. It wasn't necessary to tell this man to do this or that man to do that, Kirchner
said. They had been trained. They had the order in which they were supposed to climb the ropes, and the men were all moving right in and starting to climb up the
cliff. Kirchner went down the beach to report to Colonel Rudder that the DCOM, Paney Commander's LCA, had sunk. He found Rudder starting to climb one of the rope ladders. He didn't seem particularly interested in me informing him that I was assuming command of the company. He told me to get the hell out of there and get up and climb my rope. Kirchner did as ordered. He found climbing the cliff very easy, much easier than some of the practice climbs back in England. The machine gun and the incoming tide gave Sergeant Gene Elder a certain urgency to get off the beach and up the cliff. He and his squad free-climbed as they were unable to touch the cliff. When they reached the top, I told them, "Boys, keep your heads down because headquarters has fouled up again and has issued the enemy live ammunition. Other Rangers had trouble getting up the cliff. I went up about, 40, 50 feet, Pifit Sigurd Soonby remembered. The rope was wet and kind of muddy. My hands just couldn't hold, they were like grease, and I came sliding back, down. As I was going down, I wrapped my foot around the rope and slowed myself. Up as much as I could, but still I burned my hands. If the rope hadn't been so wet, I wouldn't have been able to hang on for the burning. I landed right beside Sweeney there, and he says, "What's the matter, sunbeast chicken? Let me. I'll show you how to climb." So he went up first, and I was right. Up after him, and when I got to the top, Sweeney says, "Hey, Sunby, don't forget to zigzag. Sergeant William Elrod Petty, who had the reputation of being one of the toughest of the Rangers, a man short on temper and long on aggressiveness, also had trow, blue with a wet and muddy rope. As he slipped to the bottom, Captain Walter Block, the medical officer, said to Petty, "Soldier, get up that rope to the top of the cliff." Petty turned to Block, stared him square in the face, and said, "I've been trying to get up this goddamned rope for 5 minutes, and if you think you can do any better, you can well do it yourself." Block turned away, trying to control his own temper. Germans on the top managed to cut 2 or 3 of the ropes, while others tossed grenades over the cliff, but bar men at the base and machine gun fire from. Satterley kept most of them back from the edge. They had not anticipated an attack from the sea, so their defensive positions were inland. In addition, the Rangers had tied pieces of fuse to the grapnels and lit them just before firing the rockets. The burning fuses made the Germans think that the grapnels were some kind of weapon about to explode, which kept them away. Within 5 minutes, Rangers were at the top. Within 15 minutes, most of the fighting men were up. One of the first to make it was a country preacher from Tennessee, Poet Ralph Davis, a dead shot with a rifle and cool under pressure. When he got up, he dropped his pants and took a crap. The war had to stop for a while, until preacher could get organized, one of his buddies commented. As the tide was reducing the beach to almost nothing, and because the attack from the sea, although less than 200 Rangers strong, was proceeding, Colonel Rudder told Lieutenant Eichner to send the code message tilt. That told the float ing reserve of A and B companies, 2nd Rangers, and the 5th Ranger Battalion to land at Omaha Beach instead of Pointe du Hoc. Rudder expected them to pass through Vierville and attack Pointe du Hoc from the eastern landward side. On the beach, there were wounded who needed attention. Sergeant South had barely got ashore when the first cry of medic went out, and I shrugged off my pack, grabbed my aid kit, and took off for the wounded man. He had been shot in the chest. I was able to drag him in closer to the cliff. I'd no sooner taken care of him than I had to go to another and another and another. Captain Block set up an aid station. As I got over the top of the cliff, Lieutenant Kirchner recalled, it didn't look anything at all like what I thought it was going to look like. The Rangers had IE'd aerial photos and maps and sketches and sand table mock-ups of the area, but the bombardment from air and sea had created a moonscape. It was just one large shell crater after the other. 50 years later, Pointe du Hoc remains an incredible, overwhelming sight. It is hardly possible to say which is more impressive, the amount of reinforced concrete the Germans poured to build their casemates, or the damage done to them and the craters created by the bombs and shells. Huge chunks of concrete, as big as houses, are scattered over the kilometer-square area as if the gods were playing dice. The tunnels and trenches were mostly obliterated, but enough of them still exist to give an idea of how much work went into building the fortifications. Some railroad tracks remain in the underground portions. They were for handcarts used. To move ammunition, there is an enormous steel fixture that was a railroad turntable. Surprisingly, the massive concrete observation post at the edge of the cliff remains intact. It was the key to the whole battery. From it, one has a perfect view of both Utah and Omaha beaches. German artillery observers in the post had radio and underground telephone communication with the casemates. The craters are as big as 10 meters across, a meter or two deep, some even deeper. They number in the hundreds. They were a godsend to the Rangers, for they provided plenty of immediate cover. Once on top, Rangers could get to a crater in seconds, then begin firing at the German defenders. What most impresses tourists at Pointe du Hoc, who come today in the Thao sands from all over the world, is the sheer cliff and the idea of climbing up it by rope. What most impresses military professionals is the way the Rangers went to work once they got on top. Despite the initial disorientation, they quickly recovered and went about their assigned tasks. Each platoon had a specific mission to knock out a specific gun emplacement. The men got on it without being told. Germans were firing sporadically from the trenches and regularly from the Chinese gun position on the eastern edge of the fortified area and from a 20mm anti-E aircraft gun on the western edge, but the Rangers ignored them to get to the casemates. When they got to the casemates, to their amazement, they found that the guns were telephone poles. Tracks leading inland indicated that the 155mm cannon had been removed recently, almost certainly as a result of the preceding air bombard. The Rangers never paused. In small groups, They began moving inland to Ward, their next objective, the paved road that connected Grand Camp and Vireville, to set up roadblocks to prevent German reinforcements from moving to Omaha. Lieutenant Kirchner moved forward and got separated from his men. I remember landing in this zigzag trench. It was the deepest trench I'd ever seen. It was a narrow communications trench, 2 feet wide, but 8 feet deep. About every 25 yards it would go off on another angle. I was by myself, and I never felt so lonesome before or since, because every time I came to an angle, I didn't know whether I was going to come face to face with a German or not. He was filled with a sense of anxiety and hurried to get to the road to join his men, because I felt a whole lot better when there were other men around. Kirchner followed the trench for 150 meters before it finally ran out near the ruins of a house on the edge of the fortified area. Here he discovered that Point Duhawk was a self-contained fort in itself, surrounded on the land side with mine, fields, barbed wire entanglements, and machine gun emplacements. This is where we began running into most of the German defenders on the perimeter. Other Rangers had made it to the road, fighting all the way, killing Germans, taking casualties. The losses were heavy. In Kirchner's D Company, only 20 men were on their feet out of the 70 who had started out in the LCAs. Too calm. Paney commanders were casualties. Lieutenants were now leading D and E Captaper. Otto Masny led F Company. Kirchner checked with the 3 COs and learned that all the guns were missing. So at this stage we felt rather disappointed, not only disappointed, but I felt awfully lonesome as I realized how few men we had there. The lieutenants decided that there was no reason to go back to the fortified area, and agreed to establish a perimeter around the road and try to defend ourselves, and wait for the invading force that had landed on Omaha Beach to come up. At the base of the cliff at around 0730, Lieutenant Eichner sent out a message by radio. Praise the Lord. It signified that the Rangers were on top of the cliff. At 0745, Colonel Rudder moved his command post up to the top, establishing it in a crater on the edge of the cliff. Captain Block also climbed a rope to the top and set up his aid station in a 2-room concrete emplacement. It was pitch black and cold inside. Block worked by flashlight in one room, using the other to hold the dead. Sergeant South remembered, the wounded coming in at a rapid rate, we could only keep them on litters stacked up pretty closely. It was just an endless process. Periodically, I would go out and bring in a wounded man from the field, leading one back and ducking through the various shell craters. At one time, I went out to get someone and was carrying him back on my shoulders when he was hit by several other bullets and killed. The fighting within the fortified area was confused and confusing. Germans would pop up here, there, everywhere, fire a few rounds, then disappear back. Underground. Rangers could not keep contact with each other. Movement meant crawling. There was nothing resembling a front line. Germans were taken prisoner, so were some Rangers. In the observation post, a few Germans held out D, spite repeated attempts to overrun the position. The worst problem was the machine gun on the eastern edge of the fortified area, the same gun that had caused so many casualties on the beach. Now it was sweeping back and forth over the battlefield whenever a Ranger tried to move. Dare told Lieutenant Vermeer to eliminate it. Vermeer set out with a couple of men. We moved through the shell craters and had just reached the open ground where the machine gun could cover us also, when we ran into a patrol from F Company on the same mission. Once we ran out of shell holes and could see nothing but a flat 200-300 yards of open ground in front of us. I was overwhelmed with the sense that it would be impossible to reach our objective without heavy losses. The heaviest weapon the Rangers had was a bar, hardly effective over that distance. Fortunately, orders came from Rudder to hold up a moment. An attempt was going to be made to shoot the machine gun off the edge of that cliff with guns from a destroyer. That had not been tried earlier because the shorefire control party, headed by Captain Jonathan Harwood from the artillery and Navy Lieutenant Kenneth Norton, had been put out of action by a short shell, but by now Lieutenant Eichner was on top, and he had brought with him an old World War I signal lamp with shutters on it. He thought he could contact the Satterley with it. Rudder told him to try. Eichner had trained his men in the international Morse code on the signal lamp, with the idea that we might just have a need for them. I can recall some of the boys fussing about having to lug this old, outmoded equipment on D-Day. It was tripod-mounted, a dandy piece of equipment with a telescopic sight and a tracking device to stay lined up with a ship. We set it up in the middle of the shell hole commie man post and found enough dry cell batteries to get it going. We established communications and used the signal lamp to adjust the naval gunfire. It was really a lifesaver for us at a very critical moment. Satterley banged away at the machine gun position. After a couple of adjustments, Satterley's 5-inch guns blew it off the cliffside. Eichner then used the lamp to ask for help in evacuating wounded. A whaleboat came in but could not make it, due to intense German fire. The Rangers were cut off from the sea, with the Vierville draw still firmly in gear. Man-hands, they were getting no help from the land side, with the radios out of commission. They had no idea how the invasion elsewhere was going. The Rangers, on Pointe du Hoc, were isolated. They had taken about 50% casualties. A short shell from British cruiser Glasgow had hit next to Rudder's command post. It killed Captain Harwood, wounded Lieutenant Norton, and knocked Colonel Rudder off his feet. Lieutenant Vermeer was returning to the CP when the shell burst. What he saw, he never forgot. The hit turned the men completely yellow. It was as though they had been stricken with jaundice. It wasn't only their faces and hands, but the skin beneath their clothes and the clothes which were yellow from the smoke of that shell. It was probably a colored marker shell. Rudder recovered quickly. Angry, he went out hunting for snipers, only to get shot in the leg. Captain Block treated the wound. Thereafter, Rudder stayed in his CP, more or less, doing what he could to direct the battle. Vermeer remarked that the biggest thing that saved our day was seeing Colonel Rudder controlling the operation. It still makes me cringe to recall the pain he must have endured trying to operate with a wound through the leg and the concussive force he must have felt. From the close hit by the yellow-colored shell, he was the strength of the whole operation. On his return trip in 1954, Rudder pointed to a buried blockhouse next to his CP. "We got our first German prisoner right here," he told his son. He was a little, freckle-faced kid who looked like an American. I had a feeling there were more of them around, and I told the Rangers to lead this kid ahead of them. They just started him around this corner when the Germans opened up out of the entrance, and he fell dead, right here, face down with his hands still clasped on the top of his head. Out by the paved road, the fighting went on. It was close quarters, so close that when two Germans who had been hiding in a deep shelter hole jumped to their feet, rifles ready to fire, Sergeant Petty was right between them. Petty threw himself to the ground, firing his bar as he did so, but the bullets went between the Germans, who were literally at his side. The experience so unnerved them they threw their rifles down, put their hands in the air, and called out, "Kamerad, kamerad!" A buddy of Petty's, who was behind him, commented dryly, "Hell, Elrod, that's a good way to save ammunition, just scare 'em to death." In another of the countless incidents of that battle, Lieutenant Jacob Hill spotted a man machine gun behind a hedgerow just beyond the road. It was firing in the aerial direction of some hidden Rangers. Hill studied the position for a few moments, then stood up and shouted, "You bastard sons of bitches, you couldn't hit a bull in the ass with a bass fiddle," as the startled Germans spun their gun around. Hill lobbed a grenade into the position and put the gun out of action. The primary purpose of the Rangers was not to kill Germans or take prisoners, but to get those 155mm cannon. The tracks leading out of the casemates and the effort the Germans were making to dislodge the Rangers indicated that they had to be around somewhere. By 08:15, there were about 35 Rangers from Companies D and E at the perimeter roadblock. Within 15 minutes, another group of 12 from Company F joined up. Excellent soldiers, those Rangers. They immediately began patrolling. There was a dirt road leading south, inland. It had heavy tracks. Saint Leonard. Lommel and Jack Kuhn thought the missing guns might have made the tracks. They set out to investigate. At about 250 meters, 1 kilometer inland, Lommel abruptly stopped. He held his hand out to stop. Kuhn turned and half whispered, "Jack, here they are, we found them, here are the goddamned guns." Unbelievably, the well-camouflaged guns were set up in battery, ready to fire in the direction of Utah Beach, with piles of ammunition around them, but no Germans. Lommel spotted about 100 Germans 100 meters or so across an open field, apparently forming up. Evidently, they had pulled back during the bombardment, for fear of a stray shell setting off the ammunition dump, and were now preparing to man their guns, but they were in no hurry, for until their infantry drove off the Rangers and reoccupied the observation post, they could not fire with any accuracy. Lommel never hesitated. "Give me your grenades, Jack," he said to Kuhn. "Cover me. I'm gonna fix 'em." He ran to the guns and set off thermite grenades in the coil and traversing mechanisms of 2 of the guns, disabling them. He bashed in the sights of the 3rd gun. "Jack, we gotta get some more thermite grenades." He and Kuhn ran back to the highway, collected all of the thermite grenades from the Rangers in the immediate area, returned to the battery, and disabled the other 3 guns. Meanwhile, Sergeant Frank Rupinski, leading a patrol of his own, had discovered a huge ammunition dump some distance south of the battery. It, too, was unguarded. Using high explosive charges, the Rangers detonated it. A tremendous explosion occurred as the shells and powder charges blew up, showering rocks, sand, leaves, and debris on Lommel and Kuhn. Unaware of Rupinski's patrol, Lommel and Kuhn assumed that a stray shell had hit the ammo dump. They withdrew as quickly as they could and sent word back to Rudder by Runner that the guns had been found operate with a wound through the leg and the concussive force he must have felt from the clothes hit by the yellow-colored shell. He was the strength of the whole operation. On his return trip in 1954, Rudder pointed to a buried blockhouse next to his CP. "We got our first German prisoner right here," he told his son. He was a little, freckle-faced kid who looked like an American. I had a feeling there were more of them around, and I told the Rangers to lead this kid ahead of them. They just started him around this corner when the Germans opened up out of the entrance. And he fell dead, right here, face down with his hands still clasped on the top of his head. Out by the paved road, the fighting went on. It was close quarters, so close that, when 2 Germans who had been hiding in a deep shelter hole jumped to their feet, rifles ready to fire, Sergeant Petty was right between them. Petty threw himself to the ground, firing his bar as he did so, but the bullets went between the mans who were literally at his side. The experience so unnerved them they threw their rifles down, put their hands in the air, and called out, "Kamerad, kamerad." A buddy of Petty's who was behind him commented dryly, "Hell, Elrod, that's a good way to save ammunition. Just scare him to death." In another of the countless incidents of that battle, Lieutenant Jacob Hill spotted a man machine gun behind a hedgerow just beyond the road. It was firing in the gin. Aerial direction of some hidden rangers. Hill studied the position for a few moments, then stood up and shouted, "You bastard sons of bitches, you couldn't hit a bull in the ass with a bass fiddle." As the startled Germans spun their gun around, Hill lobbed a grenade into the position and put the gun out of action. The primary purpose of the Rangers was not to kill Germans or take prisoners, but to get those 155mm cannon. The tracks leading out of the casemates and the effort the Germans were making to dislodge the Rangers indicated that they had to be around somewhere. By Aero 815, there were about 35 Rangers from Companies D and E at the per-imeter roadblock. Within 15 minutes, another group of 12 from Company F joined up. Excellent soldiers, those Rangers. They immediately began patrolling. There was a dirt road leading south, inland. It had heavy tracks. Sergeants Leonard, Lommel, and Jack Kuhn thought the missing guns might have made the tracks. They set out to investigate. At about 250 meters, 1 kilometer inland, Lommel abruptly stopped. He held his hand out to stop Kuhn, turned and half-whispered, "Jack, here they are. We've found 'em. Here are the goddamned guns." Unbelievably, the well-camouflaged guns were set up in battery, ready to fire in. The direction of Utah Beach, with piles of ammunition around them, but no Germans. Lommel spotted about 100 Germans 100 meters or so across, and an open field, apparently forming up. Evidently they had pulled back during the bombardment for fear of a stray shell setting off the ammunition dump, and were now preparing to man their guns, but they were in no hurry, for until their infantry drove off the Rangers and reoccupied the observation post, they could not fire with any accuracy. Lommel never hesitated. "Give me your grenades, Jack," he said to Kuhn. "Cover me. I'm gonna fix 'em." He ran to the guns and set off thermite grenades in the recoil and traversing mechanisms of 2 of the guns, disabling them. He bashed in the sights of the 3rd gun. "Jack, we gotta get some more thermite grenades." He and Kuhn ran back to the highway, collected all of the thermite grenades from the Rangers in the immediate area, returned to the battery, and disabled the other 3 guns. Meanwhile, Sergeant Frank Rupinski, leading a patrol of his own, had discovered a huge ammunition dump some distance south of the battery. It, too, was unguarded. Using high explosive charges, the Rangers detonated it. A tremendous explosion occurred as the shells and powder charges blew up, showering rocks, sand, leaves, and debris on Lommel and Kuhn. Unaware of Rupinski's patrol, Lommel and Kuhn assumed that a stray shell had hit the ammo dump. They withdrew as quickly as they could and sent word back to Rudder by runner that the guns had been found and destroyed.